Y'all have too many whitetail? I'm happy to help you with your problem. Especially the 170 class folks. Yeah, I had a little problem. I had a heart attack 5 years ago. In fact, the EMT said to me, "Sir, you're having the widowmaker." And I said, "That's not possible. I've never been married." He said, "Sir, this is no time to joke." I said, "Well, it's my heart attack." And then afterwards, the network asked me, "Well, should you want us to tell the audience what happened?" I said, "Of course, tell them. These people watch CNN. They'll make up something else. They'll reverse the reality. So tell them what happened." But you can explain it this way. Apparently, I survived my heart attack because heaven didn't want me, and hell was afraid I'll take over. Here I am after the second procedure. Still hungry. It's great to be here, truly is. And I want to address a problem that is very much part of our society. And this is, they mentioned at the outset here, that society is dealing with a basic value. Deacon mentioned it earlier in the examination of conscience talk that he gave this morning. It's relativism. Now, what do we mean by that, first of all? And this is when people in our culture say there is no such thing as absolute truth. I have my truth, you have your truth. And we just learn to accept those differences. And it sounds fine at the outset. Yeah, this is a good way to avoid conflict in our society. And this is oftentimes said to apply to various issues of religion. And how many of you have heard it said, well, religion is the biggest cause of war in history anyway, so we have to stop religious arguments. Ever hear that? I hope you know that that is not as useful as the leavings in a feed pen. You know, that's just nonsense. You know it's not true. Not even close. When you take a look at the history of Christianity, how many people actually died in religious wars over the last 2,000 years? Religious wars of Christianity. Anybody know? It's 2.25 million. That includes the Crusades. Crusades were 250 years of fighting. And fewer people died in the Crusades than in the 4 years of the war between the states in this country. More people died in the war between the states than in 250 years of Crusades. You don't really hear much about that, do you? Now there is, with Islam, it's a different story. Christianity about 2.25 million. And in Islam, it's about 280 million. Most of whom were killed in India. 80 million were killed in India during various Islamic wars. But apart from that, in Christianity, it's just not the case. And still, Islam is not the biggest cause of death or war. It's not. Because that's 280 million over the last 1,500 years. Whereas in the 20th century, atheistic and nationalistic governments, with their wars and persecutions and genocides, ended up with killing 305 million people between 1914 and the year 2000. 305 million people in 86 years, compared to 2.25 million in 2,000 years of Christianity. It's good for y'all to know that. So that when somebody does try to say your religion is the biggest cause of war, we just got to stop arguing, that's just nonsense. Absolute nonsense. And in fact, it was the religious commitments, all the Crusaders, for instance, and others, that didn't want to do widespread killing. Like in the Crusades, they preferred to capture people and get a ransom and give them back to their families. That was more the practice. And I know that from reading both the Christian and the Muslim records of the battles of the Crusades. The Muslim records, and they coincide with the Christian records. So that's important. And it helps to undercut the argument by the relativists. But there's something more important than just that aspect of relativism, where I have my truth and you have your truth, we just learn to let each other be. That doesn't work. You cannot have your truth and I have my truth when the two of us are driving a vehicle and meeting at the same moment at an intersection. If we don't have a truth outside of ourselves, that there is a stoplight, or a stop sign that we must obey, and that the one who arrives first, or the one on the right, will proceed first, we have rules for how to go through a stoplight and such. I don't have my own truth about stoplights. This isn't Egypt. If you've ever driven in Egypt, you know what I mean. Over there, stoplights are a Christmas decoration. And the problem is it's a Muslim country, so they don't pay attention. But you know, you have to have an objective truth outside of yourself about your relationship to a stop sign or a stop signal. Because otherwise, the only way you can resolve the conflict that is inevitable when two vehicles approach the same intersection at the same moment is that the Humvee goes first and the Volkswagen goes second. In other words, the one who has the more power will go ahead. And that is a simple little illustration, but it brings out this point. In a world of relativism, what inevitably happens is if I have my truth and you have your truth, then there is no truth in between us that we share, upon which we can build a discussion. If we do not have a truth in common, we cannot discuss any issue and come to a conclusion together. If I have my truth and you have your truth, we are absolutely isolated from each other, unable to speak to each other, and at that point, might makes right. Whoever has the most power wins the argument. And if you don't think that that isn't the way that our culture has gone in recent years, take a look at the kind of rhetoric that we see in the various news agencies. It has nothing to do with the facts. It's rather the outrage only became louder and louder, or more violent in many situations, without any kind of evaluation based on data that didn't matter. And it goes on with so many other elements of our society. We don't argue on the basis of a shared truth in, say, the Constitution anymore. We argue of shouting each other down, whether it be in various protests such as we saw this past year on the streets of many of our cities, or in the House of Representatives and the Congress on January 6th. That these kind of loud protests and shouting down the other is the way to win an argument. And this is moving into the cancel culture. In our society, right now, a lot of words that we used to call dirty words, various obscene words that show up, and scatological terms that show up in conversation. Now, they're not considered so much dirty, but it's punctuation, especially if you're from New York, that they use F-bombs and others as punctuation. It doesn't mean it's not a dirty word. It doesn't mean much at all. It's just conversation. And I showed up one time when I was telling a friend of mine about how funny the movie My Cousin Vinny is. And he saw it with his sons. He said, "Why didn't you tell me about the dirty words?" I said, "Oh, they were New Yorkers and forgot to use that language. They just did what they ran." But the one dirty word left in our society is various forms of hate, racist. That's the last dirty word out there. Sometimes homophobe, a couple others, but it's mostly racist is the last dirty word out there. And this gets tossed around for some. I think someone was telling me just last night that they had to cancel something at a ice cream parlor because they were putting Jimmys in the ice cream. And that was considered racist. Some pieces of colored sugar. I have no idea why that was great, but they had to cancel Jimmy's in the ice cream. So this is a madness, not based on a logical discussion, but based on the ability to outshout and overpower anybody who disagrees with you. And it shows up in a willingness to change history, to reject history of all kinds. Now, in fact, besides various folks from the Civil War, we also see that Aristotle is being canceled. And this will not stop. Shakespeare is, of course, being canceled. This will not stop. It will not stop. This is very, very difficult. I think, on one hand, it is a secular form of Puritanism. Notice how frequently people are being told that it is an injustice or some other. They don't like the word sin, because of course that has to do with disobeying God. So they don't like that word. That's a word that they want to cancel. But they will call it some other equivalent of a great evil to disagree with them. And therefore it has to be canceled. And that nothing that has evil or injustice or sin associated with it is going to be tolerated. This is a temptation that has reappeared in our society. If you know the history of the church, you may have heard of a heresy known as Novationism. It was named after a priest, Novatian, who lived in Rome. And after persecution, there's a series of persecutions in the 250s AD. And Novatian said that anybody who had weakened in the persecution, someone who had, offered a little bit of incense to the emperor, something that they gave in to the persecution out of fear of torture, those persons had to be rebaptized. Confession could not forgive them. And that was declared a heresy, and Novatian had himself elected as an anti-pope as a result. He could only stand a church that was 100% perfect. This reappeared about 100 years later, a little bit less than 100 years later, with a group called the Donatists. Again, after Diocletian's persecution in the early 300s, this group that started in North Africa said that anybody who had denied, any priest or bishop that had, in a moment of weakness, denied the faith, was no longer a valid Christian, no longer a valid priest, and any sacrament done by such a bishop or priest was invalid because he was among the imperfect. This temptation to allow only the perfect to be considered Christian showed itself a number of times. Puritanism was part of that. Only those who showed themselves among the perfect could be considered Christian. And we see in our society a secular form of this. So the heroism of George Washington is undone by the fact that he was a slave owner, even though he not only set all of his slaves free, when it was in his will, he did set them free. And he gave them a section of Ohio to go and farm. He gave them all land to go and settle in Ohio. In fact, it's still called Mount Washington, where his former slaves settled. It's outside Cincinnati. Cincinnati didn't exist then. But that was part of his payment. They gave him land, and he gave it to the slave. But none of that matters because he had owned slaves. Or Robert E. Lee, who, when he did get slaves as part of his wife's wedding gift, got 22 slaves, he set them free. That doesn't matter. He owned them in the first place. There's a type of perfection that is demanded. And that if you don't meet that perfection, you must be canceled. But the norms of this keep changing too. That's the other part of the problem. What gets canceled and what doesn't becomes a game of Simon Says. And you don't always remember if Simon said it or not. And so people are getting canceled on a regular basis. And that's increasing. As long as they can get away with this, it'll continue. And this is one of the things we have to be very alert to. Some of this shows up in the way men and their expectations keep on being changed. On one hand, we see that there is a rejection of what is called cancel culture, toxic masculinity. Now, this is not well defined. There is toxic masculinity, toxic femininity, toxic humanity. Toxic means poison. There's some people who act in ways that are poisonous. There are violent, mean people. So, I have to be somewhat cautious about how much I talk about hunting. In some places, that's considered toxic masculinity. I just call it shopping. I don't buy meat in the store except for chicken. And I know if I said that I hunted a chicken, my neighbors would be pretty upset. But in a lot of places, you can't talk about such things. And we hear it here so often at the network. And one lady was in my audience, and she even said, "Father Mitch, how can you kill those innocent animals?" And I looked right at her and I said, "Ma'am, I don't. I find the guilty ones and I shoot them down." Here's the reason. Oh, you! I don't want to quote this. As a matter of fact, I was given a retreat up in Staten Island. And this lady from Brooklyn said, in my screensaver on my computer, it shows animals like harvesting, shall we say. And she said, "Father, how can you kill those poor deer?" So I said, "Well, ma'am, do you go to the grocery store and you buy meat?" She said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "All right. Difference between you and me is that you get hired killers to do it for you. You're like a mafia don. I'm just a local hitman." That was the point. That makes sense. That talk to your mind. But there's toxicity considered about things that are just normal to God. We are more aggressive. It's part of what testosterone does to us. It has to be channeled. We can't let it run any way that we want. We can't let our sexual desires run any way we want, or our aggression. But neither ought we to get rid of them. I always use this as an image. What's the difference between the Everglades and the Mississippi River? You know? Banks. Everglades is a flowing river. Flows from Lake Okeechobee down to the Gulf. It's a flowing river. But there are no riverbanks. And so it's just spread out, and it's a swamp that you can't drink the water. And it's pretty dangerous to go swimming in. There's a lot of other critters in there with you. And they want to eat you more than you want to eat them. So that's what you see in the Everglades. Whereas the Mississippi River has banks. There's all kind of river traffic and all sorts of other things that go on there that you can use. And this is how we have to be with, our aggressiveness and our sexuality and a lot of the other qualities that make us men. You don't just let it spread out like the Everglades with no guidance and limits. You let there be, and matter of fact, we have to construct, or our dads and moms help us to construct limits to channel those energies. You don't get rid of your sexuality, you channel it in a variety of ways. And that's a good thing. You don't get rid of your anger, you channel it. So you use it to deal with and accomplish a number of other very important things that have to be done. And sometimes it takes the anger turned and channeled into determination to get things done, get them finished. That's channeling. But it is a good energy within us, a good part of our masculinity. And if we stand up to the bad guys, this is using our masculinity in a good way. And if we challenge people to not get away with saying anything they want, but we challenge them to the truth, like I Just using as an example, the false claim that religion is the biggest cause of war. It's not. And we have to use our own minds as well as our masculine energy, sometimes our aggression, to demand that somebody tell you what is the basis of what you're saying. What is the truth behind this? Well, and watch and see how some things melt down. It takes a lot of standing up to this culture to be able to help it move away from this relativism that becomes arbitrary uses of power to subject other people to. That is key here. The relativists use arbitrary principles to subdue and subject people under them. So much of what I'm seeing in this cancel culture reminds me of the Soviet Union. My family came from Eastern Europe. Before my grandparents came, before communism or even Nazism came during right around the time of World War I. Some of them right before, some after. And we missed it, but we certainly have plenty of relatives who were still in Poland during the Soviet occupation and the oppression. And so learned a lot about it, listening to them. It was pretty bad. And I got to go over to Poland during the communist days, right? 2 weeks after Pope John Paul's first visit, which it reminded me of an old Bugs Bunny cartoon. Bugs Bunny is one of my great heroes. I love it. And it reminded me of Bugs Bunny taking a lighted match and walking into Yosemite Sam's powder keg. And then just keep tossing more matches in. That's what John Paul was doing. And it was amazing to see, but that oppression was horrible. And one of the things they would do is any time there was a problem, that person got eliminated. They got canceled. But they also killed them. That was one of the ways that the CIA could tell who had been murdered by the party from within the party. The picture of the guy would be taken out of old pictures. They would reprint books, but that person's face was eradicated from the photograph. And they said, oh, he's dead. Atrocity's done. And so on with the other. And that cancel culture is closely associated with that loss of faith in God. That was part of the Soviet Union. And this is something that we all have to be alert to what's at stake. They were able to get away with that kind of cancellation of ideas, religions, and individuals because there's no one to stop them. Again, the known fact. In the history of Christianity, there have been 75 million martyrs. 75 million martyrs. Of that 75 million, 40 million were martyred in the 20th century. Think about that. 35 million martyrs up until 1900. Another 40 million after 1900. Mostly in communist countries. Soviet Union, of course, the worst. The satellites, and then China. And they told me what it was like to be in concentration camps. killer compared to the communists. Hitler was 10 million people killed in his camps and other executions. Stalin and Lenin were 61.9 million. 6 times as many as Hitler. And in China, it was 90 million and continuing to grow as now the Muslims are being persecuted, the Uyghur population. So this is, what we're talking about is this elimination and cancellation that took place in that regime because everyone became totally afraid to stand up. How did they get that power? In the October Revolution, there were only 45,000 Bolsheviks. That's all there were in a country of 140 million people. How did 45,000 Bolsheviks so make the majority of 140-some million people afraid to stand up to them? They began with this absolute reign of terror at the beginning of the regime, just killing people in public, making sure that people know so that they would be afraid. It was the same thing that happened with Daesh, the I forget the English name of the Muslim terrorist group that came from Syria and attacked northern Iraq. ISIS did the same thing. There were 300 pickup trucks with 50 cows mounted on the back and a bunch of guys hanging out with AKs and things like that. That's all it was. But they so terrorized by their killing of people that the Iraqi army was afraid to stand up to them. They chased an army of 10,000 away because they were terrorists. And everybody was afraid to stand up to them. And we see that kind of dynamic going on with this cancellation, people wearing masks and hoods and all these other disguises so that you can't tell who they are, and then bullying people into silence and destroying property and such. And this is where most of us learn on the school playground. When there's a bully, what do? You run away, or do you walk towards him? When there's a bully, if you give in, does he then give up being a bully and leave everybody alone? No. He goes further. Most of us learn growing up that when there's a bully, you usually have a coward standing in front of you. Usually a bully is a coward. And you walk towards him and get him to back down. Sometimes you have to do a little bit more than walk towards him. But bullies usually collapse under pressure. And we see that the cancel culture is trying to bully us, especially us men, into abandoning our roles in our society. And abandon we've done. Too many men have abandoned what it means to be a man. And cancel culture bullies are taking over. I'd like to bring up as an example of men backing away from their roles. And look at some of the statistics of what's happened in my own lifetime. I was born in the 1940s, 1949, baby boomer. Dad was back in Africa. We are. And this, at that time, the out-of-wedlock birth rate, the rate of people born to unmarried parents, was 4%. That had been the same statistic from the 1790 census up until 1950. 4% of children were born out of wedlock. But in the 1960 census, for the first time, it went up to 5%. Where today, well, in 2017, the last stat I've seen, it was up to 51% of all children in this country are born to unmarried parents. And where this comes into play is, we talked yesterday a little bit, came up today, I didn't notice it, but the role of dads is absolutely crucial. It is not treated so by so many parts of the public culture. Public society, says that it doesn't matter. As a matter of fact, some of you may recall in the 1992 election, Vice President Dan Quayle had chastised the television industry for showing Murphy Brown having a child out of wedlock. And he was excoriated for that. How dare you? On this was a big debate. They just came down on him like a ton of bricks. But the Atlantic Monthly, no friend to conservatives by any means, but the Atlantic Monthly published an article in April of '93. But the article was entitled, Dan Quayle Was Right. And it was just a report on sociological studies showing the catastrophic effects of not having your parents married and staying together with each other. One of the ways I see it, and check with the Colby prison ministry guys. In prisons, 80 to 85% of all inmates are children of unmarried parents. That is the factor that makes the biggest difference. Not whether they're black or Hispanic, but whether their parents were married or not. Number one factor across all racial lines is 80% of the black guys, of the white guys, of the Hispanics. What group am I missing there? Asians. Why? They don't have that kind of rate of out-of-wedlock birth. And they're not in prison either. Ain't that an interesting connection? This is key. And again, most of the time, not always, but the vast majority of the time, it's the dads that are gone. In the absence of fathers and of men in our society, is something that guys have accepted. This is a major problem. And in the face of all of the cancel culture, and in the face of the relativism that tried to say at one point, oh, why should you get married? That's just a piece of paper down at City Hall. If I love a woman, what we do is our own business. No, it's not just your business. The business also all of the children. Not to mention the fact that that relationship that you form with that woman and the bond that you have, not only by sex, but by making a responsible commitment, is precisely what goes into making most men the men that they are. One of the reasons I love talking to couples that are long married, 50, 60, 70 years. You always hear, obviously from the guys especially, I don't know what, I'd be dead if it weren't for her. It's probably right, by the way. Women extend men's life by at least 5 years. You know what the number one factor is? The number one factor why married men live longer than single men is their wife makes them go to the doctor. You just get to that doctor right now. There's something wrong, and I want you to find out what it is. And they start saying, encourage, some guys call nag, until you go. But they use it there and they save your life. But this is one of the great things about marriage, where a couple, they meet each other. And whenever a guy says that, another guy says, she agrees that that's why he's still alive, because of her. But there is something of that maturity that comes from being responsible in that relationship with the woman and with the children you and she bring into the world. And that's not what's going on in our culture. It shows up in lots of ways. I think that's part of some of the issues with same-sex attraction. Not all, but it's part of it. That the dads don't get their boys, they don't know their sons. Part of this, and by the way, going back to Mr. Myers' talk earlier, another factor going on. 3% of boys learn the sexual facts of life from their dad. 3%. That's not enough. This should be where fathers spend time. It means that just brush up on a lot of things. They may have the how-to part, but there's a lot of the internal stuff that they don't know how to explain. It's good to study that and learn it was important. But dads should talk to their sons about these issues. It's important. And that they not only tell them the plumbing, they'll get that in health class, but also to understand the relationship aspect and responsibility. These are some of the things that we need to do as men. And we have to be willing to stand up, not accept the assumptions of relativism and its ally, cancel culture. If we don't, the kind of things that happened in the Soviet Union would go on here. Nobody should think otherwise. Nobody in 1910 would have ever guessed that Mother Russia would be the place of the greatest number of martyrdoms of Christians in history. Most of them Russian Orthodox Christians. Nobody would have said that. It was holy Mother Russia. But it happened. Nobody would have thought that Catholic Spain would be a place of persecution. People would not have expected the high level of sophistication, art, and philosophy that was part of the German culture to ever permit what happened in National Socialist Germany. Well, I remember that's what Nazi stands for, the Nationalist Socialist Workers' Party. Nobody would have expected that. It was a shock, especially in retrospect. But even some of the greatest philosophers, like Martin Heidegger, became Nazis who turned in Jews and rejected helping even his own dissertation director, Edmund Husserl, a Jew who had become a Catholic, wouldn't even help him because he bought into it. Great philosopher, but less of an authentic human being than my aunt and uncle who hid Jews in their potato salad. These are the kind of things that call us to stand up so that the culture doesn't go bad. It's not inevitable. It doesn't have to happen, but it can happen. And things are changed in history by people who are willing to change them. And that has to be us. And the great thing about being Catholic is that we have this long tradition of true thought and reflection. And prayer gives us perspective. This is a great gift, and God alone will call us to the judgment as to how we used it at this time, in this place, for His glory or not. So let's take up the fight. The Texans lead the way. I think we'll get a few other folks in the rest of the country to find out how to do it too. Thank you.